welcome to the 10th Deleuze and Guattari Studies in Asia Conference. My name is Stephanie Zhang, and it is my absolute pleasure to be your host for this conference. On behalf of the organizing committee, I'd like to extend a warm welcome to each and every one of you. We truly appreciate you taking the time to join us today. We hope the exciting program we've prepared will inspire, engage, and challenge us all, fostering meaningful dialogues throughout the next 2 days. And now, to officially kick off our event, it is my honor to introduce the Executive Vice President of National Taiwan University, Professor Shi Tongding, who will deliver the opening address. Please join me in welcoming Professor Shi Tongding.
Thank you very much. Good morning, distinguished guests and the speakers, and also Dean Liang, my old friend for many years. First of all, I would like to wish everybody a very happy Teachers' Day today. Confucius' birthday, our Teachers' Day in this nation. And so I know that when you are here, either you are to learn or to teach or to share. And most of you are teachers, so you already have a very wonderful and happy Teachers' Day already. Good. First of all, I would like to thank Dean Liao to help National Taiwan University to organize this meeting. And the meeting of this caliber is not easy to invite so many great speakers to join us today. And I am very happy to welcome everybody to join today's meeting. Tomorrow, actually, so welcome to come tomorrow. As a Executive Vice President of National Taiwan University, my goal is to try to help people to have a very cross-disciplinary discussion and collaboration. So this center is doing the same work, and it's kind of our hope to create this platform. And I know that in National Taiwan University, we actually create several courses that has technology and life. Personally, I studied a course called Technology and Humanity. We are trying to establish this kind of base for our students to not only know technology, but also has a bit of humanity consideration. And we know all the technology is not going to work well if there is no humanity consideration. So I'm very happy to join today's talk, today's conference, Technology and Life. And I know that it is because the Deleuze and Guattari study has established a new kind of philosophy and in a new way for thoughts that are shaping up the way of people to think about contemporary philosophy. And it influences a lot of different areas. And when I'm saying that, you guys know that I have no idea about what it is all about the philosophy. But then I know that its influence is quite big. And I hope that all of you here can share your thoughts, can learn from each other. And so I'm very happy to address on this meeting and feel honored that Dean Liao invited me to do so, because the theme is actually closely aligned with our vision of teaching. We are committed to foster collaboration among different disciplines, and also we encourage our teachers, our students, to interact, to pursue groundbreaking and interdisciplinary research, and help to contribute to the society and to the world. This commitment to innovation and excellence lead us to establish actually this institution. the Institution of Advanced Study in Humanity and Social Sciences in the Chinese-speaking world about 20 years ago, 19 years ago. So it facilitated the cross-activation, discussion and dialogue even more. So we are happy to see this. And I look forward for everybody to join NTU's speakers and also have more discussion on these issues. So you're welcome to NTU campus, and I hope that you can spend a couple more days, not only on campus, but also to explore the beautiful scenery and nice people culture in Taiwan. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Ding, for those insightful remarks. Next, we have the welcome speech from our esteemed coordinator, the Dean of Institute for Advanced Studies in the Humanities and Social Sciences at National Taiwan University, Professor Sebastian Xianhao Liao. Please welcome Professor Xianhao Liao.
Well, thank you, Executive President, Vice President Ding, for your very inspiring opening remarks and for lending support from the university authorities. On behalf of the Institute for Advanced Studies in the Humanities and Social Sciences, I'd like to say that it is a great honor for us to host this year's Deleuze Guattari Studies in Asia conference. Organizing such an event of this caliber, is undoubtedly a challenge. But with so many distinguished minds gathered here, it's certainly a challenge worth embracing. I would like to extend my sincere gratitude, first of all, to our joint co-organizers, the Department of Foreign Languages and Literatures, and the College of Foreign Languages and Literature at Furen Catholic University, and also National Science and Technology Council, the Ministry of Culture, and the ASC, Cultural Educational Foundation. As Vice President Ding just mentioned, the profound impact of Gilles Deleuze and Pierre-Félix Guattari on intellectual and socio-political discourses have only intensified as time goes by. In 2013, in the inaugural Deleuze and Deleuze Studies in Asia conference was held in Taipei. Now, a decade later, it returns to Taipei, reflecting the continued vitality and relevance of Deleuze and Guattari's ideas in our region, and for that matter, across the globe. This year's theme, Technology and Life, engages the increasingly significant negotiations between technology and the humanities. With this theme, we aim to explore one aspect of Deleuze and Guattari's thinking, which is less dealt with. And as the regional conference, and true to its original vision, we put particular emphasis on bringing Asian thoughts into conversation with Deleuze and Guattari's thinking. But, that doesn't mean that this is just a conference for locals. We have people from all over the world. Our goal is not only to explore Deleuze and Guattari's thinking in new directions, but also to try to bring Asian traditions to bear on and more ambitiously to complement their thinking. Asia boasts of perhaps the world's richest intellectual and religious traditions, including, among other things, Taoism, Buddhism, Confucianism, Hinduism, Islam, among others. Each and every tradition may well be able to respond and contribute to the discussions of Deleuze and Guattari's thinking. And the fact that this particular conference originated in Taiwan says a lot about our intention to take the lead in opening up East-West dialogues over this cherished intellectual tradition of us all. We are honored to welcome a diverse and distinguished group of keynote speakers and invited speakers, each offering a unique perspective on our our theme. We like to extend our appreciation of the enthusiasm from the presenters too. This year's conference brings together presenters from over 10 countries, including the Philippines, South Korea, Japan, China, India, Turkey, South Africa, Belgium, the United States, Germany, the United Kingdom, and France and Taiwan. We are especially pleased to see a strong representation from Asia, which showcases the region's vibrant engagement in and significant contribution to this field. In hosting this conference again 10 years later, 10 years after it was first organized, we pay homage to the founding members of this conference, in particular, the late Professor Han-Ping Chiu, for their vision and resolve in materializing this initiative. And 10 years later, we have indeed seen Taiwan becoming a regional hub for international collaboration in Deleuze and Guattari studies, among other things. We believe this year's conference will be yet another significant milestone in this field, further advancing the initial vision of disseminating Deleuze and Guattari's thinking in Asia and beyond, as well as complementing and transforming it with insights from the Asian traditions. Now, without further ado, let the machine begin cranking and set our intellectual carnival in motion. Thank you.
Now, we can officially begin. We are thrilled to begin our first keynote speech of the conference titled Affect, Flow, and Social Media. Our distinguished speaker for this session is Professor Ian Buchanan. Chairing this session will be Professor Wei-Hong Gao, the chair of the Department of Foreign Languages and Literature at National Taiwan University. Please join me in welcoming Professor Ian Buchanan and Professor Wei-Hong Gao. Please come on stage. Thank you.
Well, hello everyone. Well, as the chair of the Foreign Language Department, it's my honor to welcome you to the event and also to the National Taiwan University. And I think it's my great honor to also welcome Professor Ian Buchanan. Actually, I think he needs no introduction. I think he has published widely on many subjects and appeared in major conferences. But in case that some of you may not know how good he is, let me introduce Professor Ian Buchanan. He is a professor of cultural studies from the University of Wollongong from Australia. He has published on a wide variety of subjects across a range of disciplines with a primary focus on the application of Deleuze and Guattari theories. He also has published on films, literature, music, space, the internet, and war, as well as a number of other subjects. He is the founding editor of the journal Deleuze and Guattari Studies and founder of the International Deleuze and Guattari Studies Conference series. He is the author of the Dictionary of Critical Theory, published by Oxford University Press in 2018, and Assemblage Theory and Methods, published by Bloomsbury in 2021. His most recent book is the Incomplete Project of Schizoanalysis, published by Edinburgh University Press in 2021. And today's talk will be on effects, flow, and social media. Let's welcome Professor Ian Buchanan.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction. I'm starting to worry when people say I need no introduction that nobody will actually know who I am because I never get an introduction. So I was pleased to have an introduction. And thank you also to Sebastian for his kind hospitality and organizing this conference. And thank you to you all for being here. I'm going to start this talk by telling 3 stories very quickly. One's my own story and others related. And these are hotel stories, which seems appropriate since most of us are traveling here and conference life is very much about hotels. The first story is in honor of the recently deceased Frederick Jameson, who, as many people know, went to the MLA conference at the Bonaventure Hotel in Los Angeles in 1982 and got completely lost and couldn't find anything, and afterwards realized that he had discovered the key to postmodernism, and that in fact getting lost was what postmodernism was all about. And he turned the Bonaventure Hotel into a kind of a mecca for postmodernists, so you could go to the hotel and touch the reality of being lost in a hotel and understand what postmodernism is. I did actually make my pilgrimage to the Bonaventure Hotel, and I sat in the rotating bar at the top and had a cocktail where Fred and Baudrillard had similarly sat. And I didn't feel as confused as Fred, so I felt a bit disappointed that I could actually find my way around the hotel. But nonetheless, that is a sort of a locus classicus of postmodernism. The other story, which happened a little bit earlier, is Raymond Williams, who found himself in a hotel in Florida and was a bit jet-lagged and a bit tired and was watching TV and realised that he didn't have any clue what he was watching, and that he couldn't really tell the difference between the show, the advertisement, and the trailers for other shows that he might be watching and so forth. And out of that experience, he came up with a theory of flow, which was kind of dominant in television studies for a very long time. And I think both those stories are very important for trying to think about social media today, because I think the idea of lack of direction continues to be a problem, or it continues to be a thing that we would want to think about with respect to the contemporary. And then also the idea of the flow, the sort of indistinguishable nature of what we are trying to watch to try to figure out how to put it into segments. The other story I want to tell is my own story, and some of you have already heard this story, so my apologies, I'm going to repeat it. But a few years ago I was in Taiwan, and I was in Taichung, I think. My pronunciation of Chinese place names is so bad I keep expecting the pronunciation police to arrive and arrest me for having such terrible pronunciation. But nonetheless, I was in this hotel, and at the same time I was there was a bike convention. And as some of you know, 80% of the world's bikes are manufactured in Taiwan, and it is truly the bike capital of the world. So I was pretty excited. I thought, great, there's bikes going to be on in my hotel, and go look at the bikes. But what I didn't realize is that there was not actually any bikes on display. It was only parts of bikes. So you could look at, some pretty fancy bolts and fancy bearings and bits and like spokes and wheels and whatever. But there was no actual bikes on display. And it was the kind of display, it was a trade display. It's where people who made bikes would go and look at the bearings and go, these are amazing bearings, we should have them in our bike. And so what I realized was that, and I thought about it afterwards, when I think of a bike, I think of a fully assembled machine that is going to take me somewhere, and that becomes a sort of a fantasy object for me. But that fantasy object is composed precisely of those nuts and bolts and bearings and so forth, which, if you look at the bike from the perspective of the engineer and the manufacturer, is really what it consists of. And I started to think, well, perhaps we could think about the ways by which fantasy production or desiring production works in contemporary society in pretty much the same way. We look at it as the bike that can take us places that we think is fantastic and we just want to ride, but that bike is composed of nuts and bolts, which I want to call affects, and that becomes a way for us to think about desire in a sort of simultaneously material and psychic way. The other story I want to tell, which is not a hotel story, but I think helps us to begin to understand the level of attachment that we have to some of our technology, particularly our phones, is the story of Rajesh Vishwas. As I'm sure many people have done themselves, Mr. Vishwas dropped his phone whilst trying to take a selfie. Now, trying to record a holiday moment for posterity, he dropped his phone into the Kolkata Dam in central India. Now, where this story departs from your typical I lost my phone story is the lengths to which Mr. Vishwas went to recover his phone. Evidently a man of means with a highly placed government job, Mr. Vishwas initially hoped that divers would be able to recover his phone from the murky depths of the dam, but when that failed, he ordered the dam to be drained. And pumps ran day and night for 3 days, draining 2 million litres of water from the dam, which was enough to irrigate 600 hectares of farmland, before finally another government official came along following complaints from the locals and put a stop to it, and Mr. Vishwas was subsequently suspended from his government position for abuse of power. He defended his actions on the grounds that his phone contained sensitive government information. Now, it is hard to believe that he was not aware that the water would destroy his phone, thus rendering any rescue completely pointless. So one wonders why he was so desperate to recover it. And two answers present themselves. Either he was so deeply attached to his phone he could not bear to be parted from it, or else the content was of such a sensitive nature that he really could not take the risk that it may fall into the wrong hands. Either way, it is a measure of the affective power of the device and of the content of the device that was likely destroyed, that it was not enough for him, the fact that it might have been destroyed was not enough to terminate his attachment to it or eliminate his fear that somehow his secrets were not secure. Now, despite the environmental damage caused, Mr. Vishwas's story is ultimately a happy one in that he lived to tell the tale. Others have not been so fortunate. Indeed, so many people have died trying to retrieve misplaced phones that it has become a trope in its own right, as has stories of people dying whilst taking selfies. And often the stories are interlinked, as was the case with the 30-year-old Andrea Mazzetto, who dropped his phone after taking a photo of himself and his girlfriend whilst hiking on a trail in Italy. And he overbalanced whilst trying to retrieve his phone and tragically fell more than 90 metres to his death. In fact, so many people have died taking selfies, there have been calls to make selfie taking a public health issue, with suggestions that certain high-risk selfie spots be declared no selfie zones to try to mitigate the risk of fatal accidents. So I'm kind of interested in the way by which we become attached to devices and the way by which content functions in order to generate that attachment. So although I will be exploring Deleuze's notion of flow, I want to first of all acknowledge that flow, like affect, has had a life and evolution of its own, and principally with Raymond Williams. Because the thing that I think is important is the idea that a television program, this is Raymond Williams' great discovery, a television program is not by itself television, and the same can be said for radio programs. And this is because television is a multi-dimensional phenomenon. Individual programs are always preceded and proceeded by other programs that are not necessarily of the same type. So sports may be followed by a movie, and on commercial stations these programs are interrupted by shorter pieces of content, namely advertisements. At the same time, there are multiple other programs available on other channels at the flick of a switch. You would remember Bruce Springsteen's song, 57 channels and nothing on. So there's no need to ever be stuck watching whatever is on and that is not to our taste. Consequently, most television viewers approach television as a total phenomenon, or as a platform, as we now say, that typically encompasses several different types of content, such that the content in its particularity cannot necessarily be considered the driving force behind the desire to watch television. And for someone like me who comes from a literature background, this is quite a hard pill to swallow, because with literature you always think of the book and the single novel or poem or whatever as being the fundamental object in and of itself. But I think with television it's impossible to isolate a single program and give it that level of attention, because you always have to see it as part of a larger flow. And I have always thought that it was Philip K. Dick who best got the affective truth, as it were, of television in his book Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep? One of the characters in that novel uses what's called a Penfield mood organ, and it's weird this device is not in the film. And what he does is he dials up the desire to watch TV no matter what is on. Because in effect that's how we all watch television, as a platform, or at least we did before the advent of the internet and streaming services. But I think it's that particular desire that has been transferred from the old forms of media to the new. In other words, to put it very briefly, we look at our cell phones no matter what is on our cell phone. There's an Australian TV comedy show called The Class of '07, which if you haven't seen it, I highly recommend. But it's a sort of dystopian satire, if you like. And all the power goes out and there's no internet and whatever. And one of the characters is so traumatized by all this that she sits looking at her phone, which of course has no power, has no internet, nothing. And she's still trying to scroll her phone as a sort of calming device. So I think we've come to understand we have an affective attachment to how the scroll functions. So as I said, the first cultural theorist to see that television could not be thought in terms of discrete objects was Raymond Williams, and it happened to him whilst he was in Florida. And one can only imagine what he would make of contemporary media forms, which have gone much further than the 1970s television ever imagined was possible in terms of removing the spatial and temporal boundaries that define the viewing experience in pursuit of a pure and essentially unlimited but timeless duration. Falling into a rabbit hole in the manner of Alice in Wonderland has become a standard way of classifying the experience of watching YouTube, which seems to open up a rift in the space-time continuum such that one can lose hours without noticing the passage of time. If boredom was the key to understanding modernity, as Heidegger proposes in his account of time spent waiting for a train, then we can perhaps say that confusion characterized by the loss of spatio-temporal coordinates is the key to understanding the contemporary moment, which Frederick Jameson called postmodernity. Now, I'm not going to rehearse Jameson's argument here, but I do think that his description of getting lost in the hotel has a lot of elements that you would find resonant with what Deleuze and Guattari talk about. So, for example, they quote Buchner's text, Lentz, and so Lentz says, "He thought that it must be a feeling of endless bliss to be in contact with the profound life of every form, to have a soul for rocks, metals, water, plants, and to take into himself as in a dream every element of nature like flowers that breathe with the waxing and the waning of the moon. The same sense of indescribable vividness and loss of praxis and intentionality is to be found in both that text and Jameson's. Ironically, Jameson also proposed that the arrival of this moment in our collective cultural history signalled the end of affect's usefulness as a concept and suggests that it should instead be replaced by the notion of intensity. And many people have, of course, written to say that they think Jameson was precisely wrong about that. And I guess in a way he was. But one could also say that as far as Deleuze and Guattari are concerned, affect and intensity refer to essentially the same thing. So as Richard Deemst has shown, Williams' concept of flow was for many years, as media studies matured as a field of research, the default way of thinking about television. And the only serious challenge came from the American critic John Ellis, who argued that television should be thought of as a segmented commodity. However, his argument that Williams failed to notice that TV programming segments are actually discrete and often unrelated misses the point that it was precisely this aspect of television that he wanted to explain. The fact that television is segmented is obvious. What is not so obvious is why we do not experience it that way, why it doesn't matter to us that they are segmented, and why we experience it as flow. And what is interesting to me and why I've sort of started this way is that for Deleuze and Guattari, segment and flow go together, that you cannot have flow without segments, and segmentation is precisely what happens to flow. So 2 years before Raymond Williams had his epiphany in Miami, Deleuze and Guattari were also writing about flow, though not in relation to media. In Anti-Oedipus, we are told that desiring machines, which are the forerunners to the assemblage, do two things. They set flows in motion and they disrupt flows. And to quote them, they say, "For every organ machine and energy machine, all the time, flows and interruptions." Despite its prominence on literally the first page of Anti-Oedipus, this key aspect of Deleuze and Guattari's conception of the assemblage has been largely overlooked or ignored by assemblage theory as it has developed over the last 2 decades. Yet, in the absence of a notion of flow, which, like so many of Deleuze and Guattari's concepts, also has several cognates such as molecularity and flight and so on, it is difficult to grasp what they mean by saying desire is productive. For it is precisely flows that a productive desire produces and draws its surplus from. So isolated from its fundamental relation to flow, which is by definition external to the assemblage that disrupts it, it is easy to see how the concept of the assemblage has come to be understood as assembling of some kind of self-contained, self-powering combination of things, when in fact it should be understood as an apparatus for the production and capture of flows. If the assemblage is a constellation of converging singularities and traits deducted from the flow, then that means the flow itself consists of disaggregated singularities and traits, or what I'm calling affects, for the want of a better word, we could call their pure state. Now, one of the things that is obviously troubling, so Deleuze and Guattari's initial examples of flows are blood, milk, and so on and so forth, which I think is kind of misdirecting our attention because it makes us think that flows are only material things, but ultimately what they're really trying to say is that all flows are flows of desire. So in most cases, flow means the constant movement of an object that stays the same, such as the flow of water in a river, which is why it's important to remember that for Deleuze and Guattari, flow is actually flux, because flux also has an obvious connection to metallurgy, which they talk about. But it is my sense that we need to look elsewhere if we were to grasp the concept correctly. And so having said that, it is, I think, helpful to keep in mind that in metallurgy, flux refers to any material added to a mix of metals to ensure that it flows, usually by preventing oxidation, which would cause the flow to solidify, thus bringing the metamorphosis of rock to metal to a premature halt. And I think it is this metamorphic capacity that is central to the idea of the flow. So in Deleuze and Guattari's conception of it, flow has three defining characteristics. It is ideal, it is continuous, and it is inexhaustible. Deleuze and Guattari sometimes use the term hylae in place of flow, which, as they define it, designates the pure continuity that any one sort of matter ideally possesses. So flow takes the form of what Deleuze and Guattari refer to as a connective synthesis, and, as they often put it, and can be said to exist wherever this pattern of continuous connection can be found in ideal continuous form, namely the flow, and it functions very differently to its component parts. So think, for example, of the difference between the still image and the moving image, which of course is central to Deleuze's book on cinema. Even if the latter is ultimately composed of the former, it is nevertheless different in kind because it cannot be constituted solely in spatial terms. Which is why I always insist that the idea of the assemblage needs to be thought of as an arrangement, because arrangement is both spatio and temporal. So Deleuze's and Guattari's answer to the obvious question or problem of how do flows of materials and signs become ideal, continuous, and inexhaustible, and thereby become flows, is a paradoxical one, because they say a flow becomes these things at the moment that it is interrupted. So, and I'm quoting here, far from being the opposite of continuity, the break or interruption conditions this continuity. It presupposes or defines what it cuts into as an ideal continuity. The machine produces an interruption of the flow only insofar as it is connected to another machine that supposedly produces this flow. End of quote. So it is subtraction, not addition, that generates the flow, that opens up the world of pure possibility that is machinic rather than mechanical, which is to say, self-propelling. Flows do not come from nowhere and they cannot sustain themselves, but insofar as they are flowing, they have momentum. Now, I do not want to continue with the visceral examples that Deleuze and Guattari give, because I think they give a kind of false impression. So I will instead turn to their work on cinema, or to Deleuze's work on cinema, which I think offers a useful illustration of this. So Deleuze cites a beautiful passage from Ballas's account of a sequence from a Joris Ivens film called Rain, as an illustration of the concept of what is translated as the any space whatever, that I think is a fine illustration of flow. He says, rain is not determined concrete rain which has fallen somewhere, these visual impressions are not unified by a spatial or temporal representation. What is perceived here with the most delicate sensibility is not what rain really is, but the way in which it appears when silent and continuous. It drips from leaf to leaf, when the mirror of the pond has goose pimples, when the solitary drop hesitatingly seeks its pathway on the window pane, when the life of a city is reflected on the wet asphalt." End of quote. So the rain on the leaves and on the pond and on the window pane and on the asphalt and. The sequence of images are connected without being unified and without one necessarily leading to the other. The raindrops are continuous and abstract, not rain somewhere, but rain anywhere, or rain such as it is, as though the rain dissolved the particularity of its location and replaced it with the temporality of "it is raining." It is also rain found in all its variations, from single drops to pools, which is to say what we call rain is in fact the superlinear synthesis we form in response to a sequence of images. And he offers another example drawn from the bridge in Rotterdam, which I have to admit I'm very sad I didn't get a chance to see when I was in Rotterdam recently. Flows have two other characteristics that I want to mention before I turn to their creation. First, flow is characterized by the superlinearity of its connections, which is to say the connections that constitute it are both spatial and temporal, as I've said. And Deleuze and Guattari explained this point in terms of the difference between genetic code and language. Genetic linearity is above all spatial, they say, even though its segments are constructed and reproduced in succession. Thus, at this level, it does not require effective overcoding of any kind. By contrast, the temporal linearity of language expression relates not only to a succession, but to a formal synthesis in which time constitutes a process of linear overcoding and engenders a phenomenon unknown on other strata, which they call translation or translatability. So social media, I think, is an ongoing demonstration of this point. Facebook, Tumblr, Instagram, and so on came into being right at the moment that digital photography and mobile phones began to create an unprecedented superabundance of images that these platforms could capitalize on by transforming into flows. By creating platforms where these images could be curated, exhibited, and archived, they unlock the potential to flow of the millions of discrete folders of images all around the world, and in doing so unleash their own flows, or what we today know as the feed, which does indeed appear to be ideal, continuous, and literally inexhaustible. Now, social media isn't a field of dreams, which is to say it wasn't enough for the platforms to be simply created for people to start using them. It took the developers longer to figure out how to create the social machines needed to draw the users to the platforms than it did to fabricate the technical machines underpinning the platforms. Facebook might have been stillborn if Zuckerberg hadn't rapidly moved beyond the platform's frat boy beginning as a hot or not ratings page for his fellow residents at Harvard's Kirkland House and reconceived it as a global pin-up board, i.e. the wall as it used to be known. Now, this is not the place to recount the history of social media, but it may be useful to look at the feed as it currently functions and identify the characteristics which make it both plausible and useful to designate it as flow. So if it is the feed that functions as flow, not the images themselves, then it is the algorithms underpinning the feed that function as the assemblages that both cause the flow and seek to disrupt the flow. And in a remarkably prescient passage in his final book, Camera Obscura, published in 1980, Roland Barthes put forward two concepts that capture well, I think, the syncopated rhythm of the flow and its disruptions. And these are the concepts of studium and punctum. So Barthes defines studium as the very wide field of, and I absolutely love this phrase, of unconcerned desire, of various interests, of inconsequential taste, of the I like it, don't like it variety. The studium is the order of liking, not loving, and I'm quoting from Barthes here. It mobilizes a half desire, a demi-volition. It is the same sort of vague, slippery, irresponsible interest one takes in the people, the entertainments, the books, the clothes that one finds all right. And today, obviously, it is embodied in the thumbs up of the like button, which means I have seen it, I found it interesting, and I wanted you to know that I have seen it and I found it interesting, but does not mean I necessarily love it or that I even care. And my children always tell me that if you respond to someone's message with a thumbs up, so this is for the old people in the room, if you respond to someone's people's message with a thumbs up, it basically means you're telling them to fuck off. So just so you know, right? So, you know, these old people that are my friends, no more of these thumbs up. It's completely outside of etiquette. So Barth argues that the studium encourages us to see pictures from the perspective of their creators rather than our own as spectators, and therefore gives rise to knowledge and understanding. In doing so, he backdates the advent of the so-called prosumer by several decades and suggests that it is in some way an essential characteristic of the image rather than an outgrowth of the user interface facility of social media platforms. Now, by contrast, punctum is that which disrupts and disturbs, Barth says, the studium. Punctum in Latin refers to the wound or mark made by a pointed instrument, from which we get the word punctuation, which ironically Latin did not have. So Latin did not have full stops, and yet we take our word for full stop from Latin, which has always seemed a nice irony to me. As Barth puts it, the photographs I am speaking of are in effect punctuated, sometimes even speckled with these sensitive points. Precisely these marks, these wounds, are so many points. And today, artificial intelligence programs are built to try to identify and amplify these points from amidst the studium to encourage people to stay with the feed. So captions and memes add to this, but so do we. When we take selfies in front of the Eiffel Tower or Machu Picchu, we are consciously creating, or at least trying to create, punctum images. It also satisfies the third criteria of the feed, namely that it constantly mobilizes even the most banal images to express novelty. And again, it is the job of social media's algorithms to select the images that fulfill this demand, which is why a random picture of your back garden never generates as many likes as your graduation picture. The algorithm selects the latter to share with more on your network than the former. And so it is the algorithms that are the assemblages in this precise sense, because they generate a flow and they deduct from a flow. So the same logic can be extended to contemporary tourism practices, which are, of course, increasingly influenced and shaped by social media, especially Instagram. Tourism can be understood as the desire for an encounter with the punctum image in its material form. Since the earliest days of tourism, this has taken four major forms: sites of geographical significance, mountains, lakes, waterfalls; historical significance, ancient ruins, battlefields, and so on; architectural significance, cathedrals, palaces, and so on; and cultural significance, such as festivals. Sites that combine two or more of these things are especially attractive. So Rome is a constant winner as far as this goes. You've got ancient ruins, magnificent buildings, plus headquarters of one of the world's most important religions. So factoring flow in how we think with and use the concept of the assemblage will, I think, necessitate some crucial changes in the received way this concept has been understood in the field that has come to be known as assemblage theory. Social media is what television and radio become when all the constraints concerning the production, distribution, and consumption of content have either been removed or overcome, and its business model is essentially the same. It captures attention and monetizes it via advertising. Its capacity to capture attention is vastly superior to television and radio, as is its capacity to monetize. And I read recently, Google now accounts for something like approaching half of the world's advertising revenue, to the point where it's beginning to wipe out older forms of media that were dependent upon advertising revenue. Indeed, its attention harvesting capacity is so great, I would go so far as to say I did not fully appreciate what Deleuze and Guattari meant when they said we lack resistance to the present until the advent of social media. and more especially the advent of social media on so-called smartphones, because then it became all too apparent. I find it hard to believe there has ever been anything as absorbing of attention as the mobile phone. It is the perfect example of what Deleuze and Guattari refer to as an apparatus of captures. Commuters on buses and trains, students in lecture theatres, half the people in this room, wherever they still exist, lovers having a romantic dinner for two in a fancy restaurant, people waiting in queues, parents pushing babies in strollers, all glued to their phones as though nothing else existed. In the process, social media has all but eliminated boredom as a cultural phenomenon. But having said that, I do not believe that it is either valid or helpful to think about the impact of social media in terms of distraction, as has become more or less de rigueur in critical theory. It is, of course, easy to understand why it might be characterized as distracting, because that's exactly how we portray ourselves to ourselves when we sort of say, oh, I've been so distracted. But the problem with this way of thinking about social media is that it implicitly presupposes the opposite state, and it isn't clear what that would be. Would it be focused and so on, as inherently desirable or proper? But as Jonathan Crary showed in his magisterial book, Suspensions of Perception, at the turn of the 20th century, there was concern about the deleterious effects of on people's health of too much focus and not enough distraction. So rather than think social media in terms of distraction, I would want to think about it in terms of duration or as sort of structures of the present, and taking up their Deleuze and Guattari's theme, ask why it is that we seem to need a form of resistance in the face of it. And mindful of the time and wanting to give you the opportunity of questions, I will stop there. So thank you very much.
Right now the floor is open, so if any questions?
Hi, can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Thank you so much for the talk. I found it very enlightening. You mentioned, I guess, at the halfway point or somewhere around there that for Deleuze and I guess Guattari, a flow becomes in the moment that it is interrupted. And I was wondering if you might consider a connection there between a flow becoming and Deleuze's opposition to the dogmatic image of thought, where in both Nietzschean philosophy and Difference and Repetition, he talks of the dogmatic image of thought, knowledge subordinating life and shackling how we think, and how thinking becomes a sort of capture in and of itself where it attempts to differentiate reality and put it into neat little boxes. And in such a way, wouldn't thinking then always already allow for the flow to become? Because in the moment of thought, we are always already breaking up thought, breaking up reality into neat chunks for us to understand. And so in that fashion, would then flow always already be becoming and therefore always already be a flow?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot there that I agree with, but it creates some problems. If it is always already, then in a way we can't talk about how it was generated. So I don't know how we would deal with that problem exactly. But I do agree that the way that Deleuze talks about thought would precisely correspond to a notion of flow. And one of the things that he, in interviews following the publication of Anti-Oedipus, one of the things that he always emphasized as being the difference between his project or their project and Foucault's project is that for Deleuze and Guattari, their project was sort of premised on the idea of escape, of that somehow something was always escaping, that there was always flows leaking. So it was kind of, I guess, wanting to propose the opposite model of Foucault, which is somehow everything is always being captured. And I imagine you could read the two together. Everything is always being captured precisely because everything is always escaping. And I think that is the fundamental principle of all social media platforms, that they recognize that if they fail at their job, then your attention will escape. At the moment, that escape is between platforms, so people are not looking at Facebook so much, they've moved on to TikTok or whatever. We haven't yet reached the point of leaving behind our cell phones, but that would be the the thing that all the platforms are terrified of, that people would actually start to get so bored with it they would put their phone down. So yes, there's always something escaping, but always something trying to capture it, and that I would want to call it a dialectic, but Deleuzians have an allergic reaction to that idea. But I think trying to think about those two opposite processes not as being able to negate each other, but rather as being a sort of the constant stimulus to each other. Yeah, exactly right.
Any questions? Well, otherwise, I would like to pose a question. I'm not sure whether it's an appropriate one, but I think you are the experts on this regard. So my question is, would it be possible that the flaw, I think most of the flaws could be man-made, in terms of the technology and international intelligent technology. And in some countries, this kind of flaw may be blocked, right, or maybe under control. And how would you respond to this kind of flaw possibly blocked by in some countries?
Yeah, I mean, obviously that is a real concern. But I think that, censorship is obviously an issue when we look at it from, say, the perspective of government, and we know, for example, that in China that they are blocking they blocked Google from having a strong presence in China and so on. But I think that the bigger problem in some ways is what's happening in capitalist countries where the censorship occurs because it's not deemed to be commercially valuable. Like they don't want people to be looking at certain kinds of news stories and so forth. Not because they really care about the content, but because, so Facebook, I always used to find Facebook interesting because people would post news stories and you could click on that and you could go and look at and read that news story. But Facebook became aware essentially that every time you did that, you left their platform. And so now they make it very difficult you can share the story, but nobody sees it. And so that's, I think, a much more pernicious form of censorship, because it's not censorship in the strict sense of them prohibiting you from seeing something, but it's censorship in the form of they're just not distributing it. So you think you've shared it to the world and everybody can see it, but in fact, practically none of your friends see it. And the ways by which Google has and Facebook have just hoovered up all the advertising money that's available in the world has led to the sort of dramatic shrinking of all the news media services that can no longer fund themselves. And so we have a different kind of censorship, which is that there's no money in producing news, so the news is not getting made, distributed and written about. And so I think that's even more pernicious. Like, when you sort of think, this terrible tyrannical regime has closed that off, you can sort of think, well, it's still happening somewhere else. And you can, in the old days, they used to talk about BBC, Radio 1 would be kind of beamed into countries and people could still get the news. We have a very different problem now, which is that the news is not even being produced.
So thank you very much for the lecture. You were talking about, you started by talking about the desire machine and about the fact that they present some kind of a flow that always, in a way, change but always stays the same. Now, and in this regard, I would like, can you go a little bit deeper into the question of social media in the sense that you talk about it a little bit like a monolithic thing, and also about television, and it's not. Television in the US was totally different than television in the Soviet Union or even in a country like Israel, where there was only one station. And the same thing happened with social media. It changes. It has plasticity inherent in it. What Facebook was, and I never used Facebook in my life or any other social media, but what Facebook was 10 years ago is not what TikTok or Instagram is today. So they are changing. There is a process of plasticity. The flow is not the same. The flow is segmented, but also changes all the time in a way that keep the entity, but also change it.
Yeah, so this talk that I was giving is the massively truncated version of a 50,000 word book. And I was conscious of time, so I skimmed that part too quickly. What I was trying to say is that the typical idea of thinking about the flow as like the flow of the river is that it's the continuous flow of the same thing. But when Deleuze and Guattari talk about flow, what they're really talking about is flux, which is not the continuous flow of the same thing, but rather the continuous possibility of transformation. And so when I'm talking about the social media flow, I did not mean to imply that it's the continuous flow of the same thing. In fact, I meant the opposite. It's the continuous flow of transformation. And the way by which it captures our attention is precisely by trying to figure out how not to be the same thing all the time, and at the same time continue to be appealing in the same way. I mean, that's the real key, right? Like it takes the principle that we want novelty, but we don't want extreme forms of novelty such that we would turn away and not want to look at it. So where is the medium point between sufficient novelty to get us to keep looking, but not so novel that it turns us away? And it manages that in multiple ways, because the platform itself has multiple flows within it. So you have the reels and so forth that you can look at, and that might take you down. And so you're constantly invited to go down different pathways. And if Facebook is losing out to TikTok and so forth, then that's because Facebook ceased to be novel in the way that was appealing to young children. And in a way that's because, what's interesting about these platforms is that they were created by people whose formation was in a different form of technology, and they're experienced by people who were not formed in the same way. So when I talk to my students who are obviously, decades younger than me, their experience of social media is completely different to mine. That I look at social media as like a flow of information, but they don't see it as information. They see it as duration. It's something that you simply do. It consumes time, and so that's why I became interested in it. How do we find the sort of the critical language to begin to talk about this phenomenon, which is quite different from television and radio, even though it kind of follows the similar idea of flow. And what I think Raymond Williams was trying to get at was, and his experience was, he'd come from the BBC, an environment of the BBC. He goes to America, and of course it was completely different. But what it made him realize was that in the BBC environment, he never thought about television as an institution. He only thought about it as one sort of discrete segment followed by another. So he watched shows. But when he got to America, he realized, in fact, he was watching television, and the television was a kind of institution in its own right, and that in order to think about TV shows, we had to always try to, in a sort of dialectical way, think about the part in relation to the whole. And that was something that he tried to promulgate and was very, very successful. And a lot of people found that to be a very illuminating way. And so I'm saying the same thing. We can't think about the individual images on social media without at the same time thinking about the platform and the way by which that has transformed culture itself.
Okay, thank you very much for this inspiring talk. And I think I could quickly share one of my observations and after hearing your talk. And I think this platform, this social media, pretty much platform of desires. And I had a chance to sometimes see my friends or my family members, Instagram, and I found that everybody take different interests. And I can see, they have desire for different things, right? So I think it's so, people are making their desire possible through this social media. And I think, since we kind of run out of time, and I think all of you might have some questions or comments, and maybe we could, you could stay and then talk to Professor Buchanan later on. And thank you very much for coming to the section. And I think let's take a break.